Mark 1. Conversations at the speed of sound.
There was a lot of water pooling on the runway due to the rain, and the nose wheel of my aircraft managed to push all the water rearwards down the intake of the two F-111 engines. It suffered what's called a compressor stall, loss of thrust, basically a double engine failure. And as we went over the cliff at the end of the runway, we ejected.
The voice there of Mark Kelly. Hello and welcome to this episode of Mac 1, the podcast of the Queensland Air Museum Caloundra. My name is Garry Hills and I will be your host for this final episode of Season 3. Yes, folks, that's 48 episodes now, 3 seasons of 16 episodes of the podcast. Thank you to those who've been listening. And we're going to go out with this conversation that I had recently with Mark Kelly, who had a very long career as a Qantas 747 captain, and prior to that as an Air Force pilot, including at one point captaining the Australian F-111C, and indeed experiencing, along with his Navigator Al Curr, a successful ejection from that F-111 in New Zealand, and you'll hear all about that story in a moment. Let me just remind you, or let you know if you're new to the podcast, that I recorded another conversation at the end of Season 2, so that was last year in 2022, the final episode of Season 2, so that makes it episode 32 in the podcast. I interviewed another crew who ejected from an F-111C, pilot David Rogers and navigator Peter Growder, who ejected off the coast of Auckland, New Zealand, and ended up in the open ocean in their F-111C ejection module. And we go into a little more detail in that episode about the actual mechanics and the physics of the ejection process in the F-111C, the design of it, and how it operated. So if you would like more detail about that, go back to that episode and have a listen. When I spoke to Mark, we didn't talk so much about all of the detail of that behind the scenes that was going on. We spoke about the incident itself, what happened and why, and what was the outcome. So just so you know, there is another episode that covers these two experiences of successful ejections from Australia's F-111s. So now here is my conversation with Mark Kelly. Captain Mark Kelly, hello.
Hello, Gary. How are you?
I'm great, thank you, and thanks so much for making the time to talk to us. You're joining me on the phone from your home. Now, why don't you first of all introduce yourself to us. Where are you from? Where were you born? And what are you doing these days as a pilot?
Thank you, Gary. Well, I was born in Melbourne and had a family of a law background. They all became lawyers, but I wasn't going to be. I always had looked to the sky and believed that aviation was in my future. But I did graduate from high school in Melbourne and was just to the post-Vietnam era. So when I applied to the Air Force to learn to fly, it was still at that time where it was a very busy military, and I was still taken by what the aviation side of things would offer. But just prior to joining the military in the mid-70s, I had actually learned to fly. I went down to Moorabbin Airport, which is the general aviation airport in Melbourne, and did a couple of trial lessons there. My dad thought that would convince me I didn't really want to fly aeroplanes, but I did exactly the opposite. So I learned to fly at age 16, and back in those days in Melbourne, you couldn't drive a car until you were 18.
That's right.
So I used to hitchhike down to Moorabbin Airport at 16, learned to fly, and on my 17th birthday got my pilot's license. And then on my 18th birthday, joined the Air Force.
Well, let's talk about your Air Force career in a moment. So what inspired you, Mark? What made you want to get up into the sky?
Well, you might find this is a little bit cliche, but when I was in my youth, we read books. It was well before the days of the internet and the like. So there was an author, W.E. Johns, who wrote about a fictional character, Mr. Biggles, Captain Biggles.
Exactly.
Who flew in the First World War. And his adventures seemed to be romantic, amazing, and it just actually enthralled me and had me looking up to the skies. And as an aside, as I've now turned a bit older, my grown-up daughters gave me the collection of W.E. Johns Biggles books, but they look a bit older than they were in my day.
You can't put a value on inspiration, can you? And here we are talking today, looking back on decades of a flying experience. I want to play you a little recording that will get us started talking about one of your most recent experiences just a couple of years ago in July 2020. And now the quality is not fantastic. It's actually you speaking, and I'd like you then to explain to us what it is that we were hearing. So here we go.
This aircraft, Oscar Echo Juliet from Manala, our last Boeing 747, will be retired, bringing to an end a history of almost 50 years with us being in the sky here in Australia.
Now, actually, dear listener, I won't play that whole clip for you because it's very difficult to understand. I played it all for Mark, but of course there's a lot of ambient noise inside the cabin of a 747. It's actually a recording of Mark Kelly's cabin announcement on board the Qantas 747-400 VHOEJ, Oscar Echo Juliet, Wanala, on its final flight over Brisbane on the 15th of July 2020. Anyway, I played the clip for Mark, and he picks up the story. What are we listening to there, Mark?
Well, it still brings a tear to my eye if you can hear it through the noise of those wonderful 747 General Electric engines. I was very fortunate just prior to the big COVID, major shutdown that I was given the command of the last Boeing 747 Oscar Echo Juliet for one of the three farewell flights. We had a farewell flight out of. So I flew the second last flight, which was the Brisbane flight, and the final one was when it went out of Sydney off to the desert. And I was the captain. It was my final flight as a training captain, and get a lot of press coverage at the time because the Queen of the Skies does hold a lot in people's hearts.
Oh, indeed, and that was a week or so before the final flight across to where it ended up in the Mojave Boneyard, I believe. And as you say, it was quite emotional for you as well. I mean, you'd had 25,000 some hours at that point in 747s, is that right?
Yes. When I joined Qantas back in the mid-'80s, Qantas was an all Boeing 747 fleet. That's all it had. And I started in my late 20s on Boeing 747s, the classic, the 200 series Boeing 747, and I never went anywhere else. I just stayed on Boeings. I was fortunate. I just stayed on the 747 and accumulated about 20,000 hours in command of Boeing 747s.
That's kind of coming towards the end of your career. Let's go back to the start again. You mentioned Biggles. You mentioned getting your pilot's license as a teenager, and then the Air Force. So tell us about entering the Air Force and what you did in those early years.
Well, if I said everything I flew in the Air Force, and of course, and probably in commercial aviation now is on a flagpole somewhere or in a museum, I learned to fly in a training aircraft called a Windjill, which is indigenous for Little Eagle, is built in Australia, and it had a big radial engine, and so a young 18-year-old was quite a handful for a young pilot to fly compared to the little Cessna 150s that I had touched beforehand. So I learned to fly down at Point Cook, the birthplace of our Air Force, on Windjills, and then moved over to number 2 flight training school at Pearce, which is in Western Australia, where I continued my training on a Mackie jet trainer. And then following graduation, went and flew Caribous. And as I touched on a little bit earlier, that was the Vietnam era, or just post-Vietnam era. Spent my time doing flood relief, army support, and of course we had overseas detachments, and I spent 6 months peacekeeping in Kashmir and flying the Caribou as a very young captain there. I still remember when I had the head of the United Nations as a passenger on my military Caribou, and I must have been at about aged 20. And the Air Force was not a large Air Force. They couldn't just take Mirage pods because they had not that many of them. So I had the amazing opportunity of being posted to number 6 Squadron to transition from flying a Caribou to flying an F-111, where the takeoff speed of a F-111 was about the fastest that a Caribou could ever fly.
Yes,
so
that's right. You mentioned museums. Now, each of those 4 aircraft that you've described, we have an example of at the Queensland Air Museum. We have a Windjill and a Mackie, and we have a Caribou and an F-111C, of course, the number 129. So, I mean, in terms of museums, we've got you covered, and our Caribou was in number 35 Squadron. It's number 173. I think you were in 38 Squadron. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, back in days, they had the more tactical of the squadrons, which was 35 Squadron, and then 38 Squadron was the training squadron, and also did general Air Force support. So I was with number 38 Squadron, but there was an intermix between the two squadrons to a degree.
Yes, in fact, I think our Caribou was in both squadrons at one time or another. Yeah, the
Caribou that I now fly down at the Historical Aircraft Museum, which is down Shell Harbour, again was one that I was flying back in the mid-70s. So what goes around comes around.
Yeah, now that's down at
the vintage of aeroplanes.
I think that's what there are only 2 Caribous flying. Is that correct?
Only 2 Caribous flying in the world, to my knowledge, and both of them are based down at Albion Park at the
Haas,
Aircraft Museum down there.
Amazing. Okay, well, so you began to talk about the F-111, and we'll go there now. You're 22, I think, when you take your first flight. Was 134, I think, wasn't it?
That's it. And I was very fortunate because A8134 was my first flight, but it is now on display down at the Australian War Memorial in their aircraft collection.
Yes.
The reason being is that it was involved in the Timor interdiction, but it would happen to be the one that I had my very first flight in. And
indeed. In fact, you sent me a photograph of you standing next to 134, and the hair seems to be a slightly different colour from what I've seen when you were young. In fact, let's go back to when you were 22. I'm sorry this is going to embarrass you, but this is from a documentary about that first flight, and this is you at the age of 22 describing to some interviewer what it was like.
The first flight in an F-111 is one that few of the students forget.
That flight was pretty exciting, as you imagine, the takeoff in my heart and my lungs and in my throat and big quiver up my spine, but it was really exciting, Can't compare it to anything else. We lit the afterburners and away it went. It just took off, and it was a fantastic feeling. I can liken it to my first solo. It's very exciting, but the first solo aeroplanes were nothing like this, and I'm really enjoying myself, and this is fantastic.
Now, that may embarrass you. I'm sorry about that.
No, not embarrassed, but just cringeworthy.
But it's great to hear. Like, you're 22 years old, and you're in command of this aircraft. I think it's a great little snapshot into the human side of this.
Well, to be honest, there was another pilot we both came from the Caribou Squadron, and they sent two of us across to F-111s. And we were, at the time, to our knowledge, the youngest pilots ever to fly an F-111. So it was a pretty big hurdle, and there were some in the F-111 and fighter squadrons who thought, no, you needed to be ex-Mirage or Sabre to be able to fly an F-111, but Caribou pilot, a transport pilot, but the Air Force train pilots to fly anything. And if you've got the skills and ability, well, you can fly anything. And I was very fortunate to have that amazing experience.
Amazing, yeah. Well, of course, that brings us inevitably to the 24th of August 1979, just a few months after you had taken that first flight. What happened that day, Mark?
Yes, I was part of a four-ship, four-aircraft takeoff. We're over on an exercise in New Zealand, taking off from an Air Force base called Ohakea. We were part of a maritime exercise out trying to pretend to scuttle some American carriers. And we were taking off that day in heavy rain. And as part of the four-ship formation, I was number 3 to take off. The other two aircraft went, and there was a lot of water pooling on the runway due to the rain. For whatever reason, the Kiwis had designed the runway to have the drain not on the side, but down the runway. And the nose wheel of my aircraft managed to push all the water rearwards down the intake of the two F-111 engines. It suffered what's called a compressor stall, loss of thrust, basically a double engine failure. And as we went over the cliff at the end of the runway, we ejected. And so this was the first known Air Force ejection from the ground. And because I'm talking to you, safely ejected.
Yeah. And the 55th ejection in the RAAF's history. And it was you and your Navigator Al Curr, am I right?
That's right. So what happened going back to the actual takeoff, so we're number 3 in a formation, the F-111 needs its afterburners to get to take off, and it's quite a short runway there, so we needed all the thrust we could get. And we were just about 90 knots or so on takeoff, and then it's just like we hit a brick wall. The aircraft just stopped accelerating. With a compressor stall, the only way you can clear this failure is to close the thrust levers and then re-push to get the engines going again. But with the end of the runway just there was no opportunity to do anything other than give the command eject as we went over the cliff at the end of the runway. A lot of airfields around the world have arresting equipment, be it cables or barriers. Unfortunately, the cable for this runway was designed for the Kiwi Skyhawks, and so wasn't certified to be able to stop an F-111. And although I did deploy the hook in the hope that we would be able to take it, the Kiwis had removed the cable that day just because they didn't want us to be able to use it and possibly break it, or it wouldn't stop us. So again, we went over the end of the runway because we just aquaplaned as we had attempted to stop because we couldn't go, couldn't stop.
So you're doing about 90 knots, I think, just as you leave the end of the runway, and so you call eject. And just explain to those who may not know what happens in an F-111 when you eject. What's the actual mechanics of that?
The F-111 was designed so that the whole capsule separates and the pilot and navigator stay in the capsule. This is a design to allow you to be able to eject at high speed because the F-111 capable of flying 2.5 times the speed of sound. If you were ejecting at high speed and just using a normal ejection seat, you probably would be killed. So going back, so the whole capsule actually separates. When you pull the handle, there's two, one for the pilot, one for the navigator joined. There's a momentary delay while charge is separate the whole capsule about the size of a car and cuts through the fuselage, separates the cables, and initiates the firing mechanism for the rockets that propel the capsule. So as we went over, there's pull the handle, there's a momentary pause, then the whole thing separates, and you get a 15 to 20 G kick in your backside as this thing just hurdles vertically upwards.
And that punches you up 400 or 500 feet, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So we're on the ground. We've just gone over a cliff at the end of the runway here. And so at 89 knots, to be exact, because that's where the instruments all cut out and show the speed we were doing. So we went up 400 to 500 feet, and then it's all silent for a moment, and you're wondering what's going to happen here. And then the cables deploy, the varying parachutes come out of the module. The nose drops down initially, and I could recall looking straight down at the fireball that was immediately underneath me because the aeroplane had gone over the cliff into a little hollow past the end of the runway and burst into flames. It was full of fuel. And then we were now pointing straight at it because we'd just gone straight up above it. And thought, well, this is going to be interesting. And then the rest of the parachute deployed, and the module then settles itself down for the landing. Airbags deploy underneath it because you can't control yourself like you are just as an individual in the parachute. You come along for the ride here, and you've got a cushioning bag that cushions the impact to a degree. But as you do hit the ground, if I can liken it to being on the roof of a three-story building, of your two-story building on a wooden deck chair, going across and then just jumping off and hitting the ground. That's what it felt like.
So you must have sustained some injuries.
Yes, I have compression fractures throughout my back. They have, luckily healed, but I did get compression fractures. And it's not fair in life because I'm not very tall. But so people who aren't tall lose height, and I lost actually about an inch, about 2 centimetres in height by the compression fractures that incurred both during the ejection and on the landing.
Well, it goes without saying that we're delighted that you were able to survive that, that experience, despite there were injuries. Al and you both went on to continue flying F-111s, I believe, didn't you, afterwards?
That's correct, as I say, if I just touch on it. So my injuries were predominantly because we had been attempting to stop the aeroplane because we couldn't go. So my backside was just fractionally off the seat. And therefore, when you have a rocket with a 15 to 20 G push, you don't need much of a little air gap there for the compressions to take effect. And so that meant that I was into a longer recovery period than the Navigator, who was sitting there and was in a better position to be able to manage the ejection forces. But we both recovered, Al without particularly injury, me with my compression fractures, and returned to flying the F-111. I was lucky enough to spend another tour there. And if I can give a little anecdotal story, the first flight that I came back flying the F-111, it has what's called a terrain-following radar.
Yes.
The beauty of the F-111, it was able to fly at around 600 knots, just subsonic, a couple hundred feet above the ground in mountainous terrain to deliver a payload to a target. I think we were going to the Liddell power stations, which happens to have just closed without having been bombed by me, but I did try to bomb it enough times. And the terrain-following radar takes you between valleys and missing hills. But it doesn't really care if you're going to miss these hills by just a matter of meters, because it just wants you to be as close to the terrain as possible. Because if you are above the terrain, you're then a target for any anti-craft missiles or fire. So on this day, my first flight back, we're doing this in cloud, about 480 knots going around, and the Navigator, who was the instructor at that time, was looking at our terrain scope to say, yes, the terrain ahead is clear. And as I popped out of a bit of cloud, there was a hill right in front of me that we were about to impact. So disconnected the terrain following radar, pulled back, overstressed me, probably the aeroplane a bit, just missed the hill, and we went back to base. And what had happened is the terrain following radar itself had been tilted off a few degrees. So it was looking not in the line of where we were going, but just a few degrees off to the side. So it was thinking this hill, we were going to pass, but we weren't. So my first flight back from the F-111 ejection was this one. And I thought, is it trying to tell me? But anyway, I then went on to a career flying the F-111 before I got posted to become a flying instructor over at one of our flying schools.
I mean, as a complete civilian and a non-pilot, it horrifies me to think that you have to surrender control of your aircraft to the computer and fly at such terrifying altitude and in conditions. It was nighttime. If it was raining, it wouldn't make any difference. In fact, I think most of the F-111Cs were engaged in night strikes. Is that right?
That's correct. And if you do have any ex-Mirage listeners, I will basically have a little smile because back in those days, remember we're talking about the early 70s before weapons got far more sophisticated. Aircraft like the Mirage didn't have a look-down, shoot-down capability. So the reason we were down there is because we couldn't get shot down by other aircraft because they couldn't differentiate easily between us and the terrain. So we were safer down there. Once we went up to any altitude, we were a bit of a sitting duck. So we were doing it at night, in cloud, hopefully, and at very high speed. And the computers that we were using, our inertial navigation system, again, before the GPS days, was the same as what had been used for the lunar landing module. So it was early technology, but still pretty amazing technology for the day.
And it worked, yeah.
It worked.
After the Board of Inquiry, after the investigation into the ejection incident, were there any changes made to prevent that from happening again with the water coming into the engines?
Yes. The Americans, who were the only other operator of the F-111, had the similar issue, but because they have very long runways and arresting gear at the end of those runways, it never caused any issue. I mean, if the aeroplane had a problem like that, it would just stop, take the arresting gear, and go back to the other end of the runway, probably go again. But, Ohakea, that wasn't a case for us. So the tyres themselves weren't chined, so the water just went straight rearwards. So the change was put in chine nose wheel tyres, which would push the water to the side, not down the engine, so that, heaven forbid, if you ended up with a similar situation, that you wouldn't have water being directed straight down the intakes of the two engines. And, of course, there were lots of warnings put in the manuals about be very cautious taking off on appalling runway conditions.
You then went on to, as you say, to be a training captain or a training pilot with the F-111Cs. When did you make the move into commercial aviation?
So I spent my time as last sort of 3 or so years in the Air Force was as a senior flying instructor over at number 2 flying training school at Pierce on Mackey's. Then I went back over to F-111s to train to become an instructor there. But Biggles came back to me again, and Qantas, who hadn't recruited for a decade or so, said, no, we now are going to expand our airline, and it was either take it or leave it. And so I took the opportunity to leave the F-111 squadron, which was a very, very difficult decision to make, but it's one I did make. And I then went over to Qantas back in late 83, early 84, to train as a junior pilot on 747s. You also had a seniority system, so it took a long, long time to be able to get your promotion. But given the fact that Qantas was now just recruiting again, I was very fortunate coming in at the start of that I spent just about a year and a bit as a second officer, which was carrying the captain's bags and getting the charts out and being an assistant, to then becoming a first officer for a few years, which is, the co-pilot to the captain. And I had a command on Boeing 747 Classics about 5 years after joining Qantas. So where I'd been one of the youngest F111 pilots in the world, again, I then became one of the youngest ever 747 captains in the world.
And you went on to a 35-year career with Qantas.
Yes, my grey hair is not because of that particularly, but I flew pretty well every variant of the 747, from the 100 series, 200, 300, Combi, SP, and I was lucky I spent some time over at Boeing, and I got to fly the Boeing 747-800 simulator before COVID beat me and I was given an early retirement.
Well, we're very glad you got the opportunity to get grey hair. You've had a long and very interesting career as a pilot. Are you still flying?
Yes, very much on a casual basis. I love aviation. I have from the start, and I love mentoring pilots, and I've been fortunate to be able to do that at flying schools at Bankstown, Camden, and Shell Harbour in New South Wales here, but also to be a trainer on the Caribou, which again where I started my military squadron career. So I'm now down there flying the Caribou. There's the aircraft number 210 and 234 are flying. I just flew the Anzac Day fly past, so those who saw it come over Sydney. So I was able to do that, and still involved now training the next generation of pilots who can keep our heritage flying. And I'm very pleased to be able to do that and mentor pilots along the way.
Well, dare I say, Mark, if you get the chance to come up to Caloundra, we would love to welcome you as our guest at the Queensland Air Museum, and we can kick some tyres from the very aircraft that you've been talking about, and you could perhaps regale us with some more stories. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you, and I hope that we can see you someday at the Queensland Air Museum. Captain Mark Kelly, thank you very much.
It's been my absolute pleasure to talk to you.
So that's our episode. Thank you to those of you who have listened all the way through these 3 seasons, and for those of you who've dipped in and out of them. It's so good to know that there are people out there listening. Thank you for the feedback. Thank you for the encouragement. Thank you for the suggestions about topics and the connections that you've provided for me with very interesting people to speak with. We look forward to Season 4 coming up later in 2023. For now, though, that's it for our weekly podcasts for this season. Don't forget, at the Queensland Air Museum in Caloundra, in Pathfinder Drive, just across the road from the Caloundra Aerodrome, we are open every day except Christmas Day and Easter Friday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m, and we would love to meet you. So come on in and see us soon. Bye for now.